Greg Sheridan is the Australian's foreign editor. Greg, as the US military pounds Iran and sinks its navy, there's a debate blowing up internationally about whether or not this war is legal. What do you think?
Yes, I think it's legal, but international law is a sort of a fictional concept anyway. International law didn't prevent Russia from invading Ukraine. It didn't prevent China from taking the South China Sea when the Joint Court of Permanent Arbitration decided that China had no claims whatsoever to the islands that it had stolen or created. Now, and also international law, there is no legislation, there is no international parliament, there is no court, and there is no jurisdiction. The only jurisdiction that exists is the UN Security Council. Given that the United States is a permanent member of the Security Council with a veto, I think it's very unlikely that the Security Council is going to impose a penalty on the United States. So I think international law is a kind of a fiction anyway. But even within the terms of international law, countries are allowed to defend themselves. And you can make a very strong case. I wrote a column about this the other day, that Iran has been attacking the United States for 47 years. It's been doing so mainly, though not exclusively, through proxies in order that the United States would feel inhibited from responding. Because if they can say, well, look, Hezbollah did it, they'll get the US to respond to Hezbollah. They can say the Houthis did it. So the Houthis attacked American shipping on Iran's orders, with Iran's support, with Iran's money, perhaps with Iran's weapons. And the Americans hit back at the Houthis. But eventually, Donald Trump has decided that grey zone tactics won't shield you from an American retaliation. If you hit America, even if you've disguised the agents that do it so that they don't, bear your uniform or something, he couldn't care less. He's going to hit you. If you hit him, he's going to hit you. And the world is a much safer place when the bad guys are scared of the American president. The Iranians took American diplomats hostage under Jimmy Carter. The minute Ronald Reagan was elected, they released them all because they held Carter in contempt. They were scared of Reagan. And it's a good thing. When the bad guys in the world are scared of the American president, we're all a lot safer.
Yeah, Greg, there's some talk from people like Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney about hegemons, a word that I hope never to hear again. And Australia is a middle power, Canada is a middle power. There's clearly some hesitancy from UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. He certainly hasn't allowed the US to use his bases. Does any of that kind of matter in the way we think about it? Should Australia be worrying about whether, for example, the US president has the right under American law to do this, whether he needed congressional approval, whether the UN Charter would regard this as self-defence or not?
It doesn't matter a hill of beans what the UN Charter would regard. I mean, look at the UN, China is often on the Human Rights Committee. The International Year of Women is often chaired by Saudi Arabia. I mean, the whole thing is preposterous. Now, it has a certain power reality. You've got to take account of that. But it's not a moral arbiter or anything like that. It shouldn't affect us one way or the other. All those questions about Trump's authority and everything are good practical questions because they might have a political consequence in America, and that might limit his discretion down the track. They're nothing to do with us, really, and they don't affect the morality or otherwise of the war. I'm not absolutely convinced this war was the right thing to do, but I'm not the least bit swayed by these kind of silly process arguments. I've been around a long, long time in this game, and I can remember Gareth Evans writing more eloquently than Mark Carney on the importance of middle power diplomacy and coalitions of middle powers can achieve this and that and all the rest of it. But, the underlying reality of life is that the strong do what they will and the weak concede what they must. And your best chance in the world is to be in alliance with a strong power. And you want your own power. You want real national power that you can exercise. So if Australia, like Hezbollah, had 200,000 missiles, everybody would be very cautious about doing circumnavigation to the Australian mainland. So you want your own power. Of course, you want coalitions with like-minded middle powers where you can get them. And the purpose of that is mainly to try to persuade the big powers to to cooperate with you. But the most important thing is your alliance with a big power. China is constrained in Taiwan, not because, Brazil, Mexico, and Australia in an alliance of middle powers will issue a stern press release if China invades Taiwan. It's constrained in Taiwan because the United States military might attack it. And everything that we regard as benign in the global world order since World War II has essentially rested on American power and American primacy. And we dressed that all up as an international system because the Americans were so benign. They provided public goods for free, and they shared their authority through a range of institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and all that. But they're not as absolutely powerful as they were. And as a result of that, you don't get, a glorious flourishing of middle power creativity. You get China and Russia deciding what happens. And, a world dominated by China and Russia is a vastly more horrible place than a world dominated by America.
How much do you think this is targeted at, and obviously not literally, China and Russia, giving them a reason to think again if they thought, for example, they might invade Taiwan or go further than Ukraine in Europe?
That's a very complex question. It's an interesting and complex question. Very hard to know what's in Trump's mind. But I certainly have tried very hard and talked to a lot of people to work out what the implications are for China and Russia. Now, there are some implications which will worry China and Russia. So Trump has shown he will take decisive military action if he thinks he should, if he wants to. Now, China and Russia held Joe Biden in contempt and knew that he would never take any action about anything. And so they felt unconstrained. Trump's a different kettle of fish. And Trump also has a bigger military budget than Biden had. And also, China and Russia had a very useful ally in Iran. It provided drones for Russian use in Ukraine. It provided oil for China at knockdown rates. That ally probably has disappeared, at least for some time, because even if the Iranian regime hangs on, it will be much diminished. On the other hand, there are some upsides to this for China and Russia. If this all goes bad for Trump, then America may be paradoxically even weaker at the end of it than it was at the start. Also, if this leads to a sustained increase in the price of oil, that probably helps Russia because it's still basically an energy exporter. And then finally, no one in the West, neither the United States nor Western Europe nor us, has made any serious effort to increase the production of armaments and munitions to the level that is needed. We've had years of war in Ukraine, massive Chinese military buildup. We've had endless talk fests, but no action. In Australia, we're going to acquire a submarine sometime when Leonard Nimoy comes back as Dr. Spock in Star Trek 112 or something. Meanwhile, China is producing nuclear submarines at a rate of knots. And this war in Iran uses up a huge amount of American high-tech weaponry, particularly missile interceptors. We're at the back of the queue to ever get a Patriot missile interceptor. But America can produce about 500 of them a year, using about 500 of them a minute. I'm exaggerating, of course, in Iran. So that's a big civilization-wide failure by the West. So that might help Russia and China because the Europeans want to buy weapons from America to give to Ukraine, but you can't do that if the American arsenal is too low. China, if it does decide to take action in Taiwan, might calculate, well, America no longer has enough of the high-tech munitions that it needs. So there are pluses and minuses for Russia and China, and I don't think the net assessment is, you can't do a net assessment yet.
It's always worth having a look at what the White House is putting out in terms of its messaging. And in this instance, it's pretty bombastic. I want to play you a quick grab from Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War.
This was never meant to be a fair fight, and it is not a fair fight. We are punching them while they're down, which is exactly how it should be.
And this is a video published by the White House on social media. Greg, I'm not sure if you play a lot of the video game Call of Duty, but that's what it's like. This is how the White House wants Americans to see the war. And if I were an 18-year-old boy, I would find it very exciting. In fact, I'm a 48-year-old woman and I still find that that does get my pulse racing, I must admit. What do you think? Does it make you feel squeamish or impressed or alarmed or worried that Pete Hegseth is the Secretary of War?
On the other hand, there's no doubt part of Trump's genius, it certainly doesn't appeal to me, but part of Trump's genius is an ability to communicate to people who don't consume traditional news media or politics in general. So that is a key part of his voting coalition. And young men have been absolutely critical. You know, you read learned articles in American journals. Why did the bro vote go for Trump and all this sort of thing? Now, you know, Claire, you and I are adults. I'm a few decades your senior, but adults generally don't respond to that kind of stuff much. And I think it's, you know, my own prejudice would be that it's very unbecoming to the dignity of a White House or a president. On the other hand, maybe I wouldn't put you in this category, but maybe I'm a kind of a dinosaur. And this is the way communication goes on now with a lot of people who, you know, consume TikTok and video games. There was nothing inherently wicked in what Hegseth said or in that video game video, but you know, I think matters of life and death ought to be treated with much more gravity. And one of the, you know, very unpleasant revolutions of the Trump era is that matters of great gravity are not dealt with great gravity. I mean, it's as if contemporary culture is a conspiracy against the serious. And this is an element of that. However, it's obviously part of what Trump thinks, you know, sells with part of his base, and public support for the war effort is not very strong in the United States. So I guess they want to communicate with every American they possibly can.
Speaking of sophistication, you've written very evocatively, Greg, and we've talked about here on the front how Iran is a very sophisticated culture, this ancient Persian culture that has given us so much in the rest of the world. This society has been cowed by a couple of generations now of dictators, ruthless dictators. Is there a possibility that in the rubble of whatever's left when these airstrikes stop, that the Iranian people will be able to throw up someone who can lead them into a secular democracy, or is that a fantasy?
Well, to tell you the truth, Claire, I'm not particularly optimistic about it. In Iran, the society is at war with the state. There's no doubt. There is no society in the world in which there is a bigger contradiction between the society and the state. The problem is that in Iran, the state has all the guns. One of the things that the Iranian authorities have done quite cleverly, although it's very sinister and wicked, in killing so many of their citizens, they have spread guilt right throughout the whole of the regime, from the top to the bottom. Where there's a greater chance, I think, and I'm not even particularly optimistic here, but I think there's a greater chance of this, is that you get a more reasonable dictatorship. Now, you know, dictatorships come in all shapes and sizes, and there are what the political theorists sometimes call repressive responsive regimes which are still sort of dictatorships. If you go against the regime, they'll put you in jail, but they give you a lot of freedom in the rest of your life. And they also respond to the genuine concerns of their society. There are a lot of examples of those around the world and in history. And, you know, I quoted one anonymous official as saying to me not so long ago that what the Americans wanted was a dictator who didn't commit genocide against his own people, didn't go after nuclear weapons, and didn't attack America and its allies. Well, that's a pretty modest set of requests. I think you're more likely to get that, and that could be a halfway house to a democracy. I mean, democracies often emerge from enlightened dictators. I mean, that happened in Spain, that happened in Indonesia. It's very hard to imagine going straight from the rule of the Ayatollahs to a representative democracy. The other thing is you generally don't have the institutions, you know, independent courts, proper dispute resolution mechanisms. The other thing is all the clients of the regime own all the resources. So then not only would there be demands for justice, there'd be demands for redistribution. You know, one of the things the Ayatollahs do quite cleverly to keep themselves in power is enrich the leaders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So it's both a theological and an ideological regime, and it's also a corrupt regime. Whereas if you're a regime insider, you make lots and lots of money. So out of all of that, I'm not terribly optimistic, but everything is possible. History is not governed by the common law of precedent. The Iranian people yearn for something better than what they've got. You can just see every provocation leads them out in the streets demonstrating in huge numbers. And they know every time they go out to demonstrate, there's a very good chance they'll be killed. You know, that young woman who was murdered because she wore her hair too long. You know, people used to complain about Singapore in the old days under Lee Kuan Yew. If you wore your hair too long in Singapore and you're a bloke, you might get a compulsory visit to the barber shop. If you wear your hair too long in Iran, you get beaten to death in a police cell. So it's a very savage regime. As I say, I'm not particularly optimistic about a democracy, but I think you could get a better dictatorship than you've got now.
Greg Sheridan, thank you very much.
Great to be with you, Claire.